Now it's time for Chapter 8. We have reached the place in the course, I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, where diagramming ceases to be as useful as it was previously. Mostly this is due to the fact that sentences are simply getting longer and more complex, requiring all kinds of linear maneuvers to accommodate the various phrases and clauses. In addition, though, the textbook introduces the concept on page 183 of labeling a noun clause within a noun clause as a way of explaining how a subordinator attaches to the clause it introduces. To me, this explanation is really illogical and just plain wrong. I've consulted other books and have seen no such explanation in any of them. So it might be useful to start here before moving on to the chapter material, as I'd like to suggest a simplified way of diagramming sentences. It's true that with that clauses, the subordinator that does not form a constituent with the clause it introduces, but this does not mean that we have two noun clauses. If you take the subordinator away from the noun clause, it is no longer a noun clause, but an independent clause, that is, a sentence. So if the author is trying to reinforce the idea of the subordinator not having a grammatical function in the sentence, he might have instead labeled the that clause of this example sentence this way. Here the subordinator is set off from the noun clause, although it's underneath the noun clause umbrella, but it is not part of the actual clause. Still, the tree diagrams are becoming a hassle. So here's what I would suggest. Take a simple sentence, for example. I know that you are right. This is another sentence with a that clause, which in this case functions as a direct object. So diagram the sentence, but once you get to the that clause, that you are right, draw a triangle that covers the space for the clause, label the clause here, and then provide a string that accounts for the rest of the constituents in the clause like this. The use of the triangle to mark the clause is not just something I'm making up. Grammarians and linguists typically use the triangle if the analysis doesn't require full details. For example, if I was trying to explain how compound sentences are joined by a conjunction, I might provide this as an illustration. And I've actually borrowed this from a book that I saw it in once. If you are more comfortable with doing it the way it is done in the book, go ahead and do it that way. But I think that this simplified way will save some time, and you still need to demonstrate that you know what is going on in the sentence. There are sample sentences I've diagrammed using this simplified method in a Word document that I've linked to this chapter section on the Course Connect page. So to return to the beginning of the chapter, we have basically four things to address. Two kinds of noun clauses and two kinds of noun phrases. For all four of these structures, it might help you to see more clearly what noun phrase slot it fills by turning the whole thing, as the book suggests on page 183, to a pronoun like this or even it. If you go back to the sentence, I know that you are right, if you change it to it or this, I know this. I know what? I know this. That you are right. Get it? All right, that clauses. I've already used an example of a that clause, so we don't have to go back through that again. But a couple of important additional points to make are the fact that sometimes the subordinator that can be deleted from the sentence entirely. This can, as you can imagine, make recognizing the that clause very difficult, as well as an understanding of the sentence as a whole. It might help if in diagramming such a sentence you put the subordinator back in. That is, if you had the sentence, I know you are right, which doesn't have the that, you might just go ahead and analyze it as I know that you are right. We had a similar issue when we were doing relative clauses in Chapter 6, where the relative pronoun is omitted. The other thing that needs some further explanation is the concept of extraposition that is introduced on page 186. If you haven't heard of this concept before, it might seem rather odd and not consistent with the idea of native speakers of a language using structures to be more efficient. I mean, it adds a word after all, and that word has no meaning in itself. But the textbook explains that sentences that have short subjects and long predicates sound more natural to us as native speakers. Don't know where that comes from, but that's just a tendency. But regardless of why we do it, we do extrapose frequently when we generate sentences, so we have to account for this kind of sentence grammatically. Personally, I would take any sentence that extraposes the noun clause or phrase and treat it as another kind of transformation, like we did in Chapter 5. If you take the example sentence from this section of the chapter and render it instead as "that Barbie has sold well for decades is remarkable," it has the same deep structure as the version in the book. And if you think about the term extraposition, it tells us literally that something has been done to the original core sentence. So if you are diagramming such a sentence, you can always feel free to state the transformation and revert to the original, thus avoiding having to label the grammatical subject and the logical subject in a sentence. And that's something that often gives students a hard difficult time labeling those two things. All right, so with WH clauses, these clauses we learn in the text are also called indirect questions. And the subordinators that introduce them are the same words we use to make questions out of the original core sentences that are statements. WH clauses look and work pretty much like that clauses, with the significant difference that the subordinator this time functions grammatically in the clause. It takes the place of missing information in the clause. This can lead to a more complicated line drawing for diagrams, but you can once again avoid this by using the simplified method I demonstrated before. Here is the example sentence in the book diagrammed in this manner. Again, you find the WH clause, which fills the noun phrase slot. You draw a diagram, a triangle over that space, label it, and then give a string that provides the structure of that clause. All right, so one last note on the WH clause is that whether, the word whether, is different from the other subordinators. It does not have a grammatical function in the clause, but simply introduces it. The difference is that clauses with whether are derived from yes-no questions rather than WH questions. The section on infinitive phrases is really quite confusing. Recognizing and analyzing them in their most basic form is simple enough, with it being introduced by the word to plus the infinitive form of a verb. But then we learn that the to can be omitted, or that the phrase can be introduced by for to, or even in order to, and that in the latter case they function as adverbs instead of nouns. Plus, they are described as verb phrases, since they have a verb as their head, but they fill noun phrase slots. Pretty confusing, and this will require some careful attention. Here is the example sentence diagrammed in my alternate method. It's pretty basic. Again, here's the infinitive phrase. You get the triangle and the label and the string. Infinitive phrases can be extraposed like noun clauses. If you are analyzing one of these, feel free to transform it back before diagramming it. When I teach this part of the course, or this part of the chapter in the classroom, I try to have a little fun by showing a video of the song "It Sucks to Be Me" from the Tony Award-winning musical Avenue Q. Oops, sorry about that, my phone went off. Alright, so the musical Avenue Q, the song "It Sucks to Be Me," there is a link on the Course Connect page to it if you're looking for some amusement, as well as to my diagram of the sentence, both extraposed and transformed back to the original course sentence. All right, then finally, gerund phrases. Gerunds are on one hand tricky to recognize because they are not introduced by a word that is a subordinator, but by the ing form of a verb. On the other hand, they do not have a lot of confusing variations, so overall I think students don't generally have too much trouble with them. The one tricky thing is the section on page 200 about gerund phrases sometimes having a genitive subject in front of them. You won't see a lot of these in the exercise at the end of the chapter, but should be on the lookout for them. The book's diagrams of gerund phrases are once again rather complicated. Here is my diagram of the example sentence. Okay, so you kind of get used to that whole process by now. So this is also the chapter for songs from Broadway musicals. From the Course Connect page, you might like to click on the link to the song Happiness from the show You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. In it, there are long strings of gerund phrases. It will give you some practice recognizing them and seeing how frequently we use them in our sentences. There is a Word doc on the Course Connect page, too, that highlights the many gerund phrases in it.